A split screen showing a smug man in a $5,000 suit laughing and a woman sitting alone at a table with her head down. Then a slow-motion shot of double doors swinging open. Preston Calloway thought he had won before the trial even started. He was the billionaire tech mogul with the world at his feet, and his wife, Audrey. She was just the quiet woman he was discarding for a younger model. Standing in the courtroom, Preston actually laughed in her face when he saw the empty chair next to her. "No lawyer, Audrey," he sneered loud enough for the press to hear. "Did you really think you could fight me alone?" The judge was about to bang the gavel and default the judgment, stripping Audrey of everything. But then the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open, they were thrown wide. The sound of a single cane striking the floor silenced the room. Preston's high-priced legal team went pale. They didn't fear Audrey, but they were terrified of the woman walking in behind her. Karma hadn't just arrived, she brought receipts. The morning of the divorce hearing, Preston Calloway didn't even bother to skip his morning espresso. He stood on the balcony of his penthouse at the Millennium Tower, overlooking the city of Seattle. The fog was rolling in off the Sound, but up here above the clouds, the sun was shining. That was the metaphor for his life, he decided. He was always above the gloom. "Sir." Preston turned. His personal assistant, a nervous young man named Kevin, was holding out a tablet. "Mr. Rostov is on the secure line. He wants to confirm the strategy for the press gaggle outside the courthouse." Preston took a sip of his coffee, a rare Jamaican Blue Mountain blend that cost more per pound than Kevin made in a week. "Tell Simon to relax. The strategy is simple. I'm the heartbroken philanthropist forced to separate from a wife who refused to grow with me. She's unstable, she's greedy, and she's refusing to settle." He handed the tablet back. "And Kevin, make sure the car is out front in 10 minutes. I want to get this over with. I have a tea time at Cypress Point at 3. Preston Calloway was the CEO of Calloway Systems, a defense contracting firm that had just secured a $40 billion government tender. He was untouchable. And Audrey. Audrey was the mistake of his 20s. She was the woman who had supported him when he was building circuit boards in a garage in Tacoma, the woman who had worked double shifts at a diner to pay for the patents. But that was 10 years ago. Now she was just plain. She didn't fit the image. She wore cardigans, not couture. She liked gardening, not galas. And when Preston had met Isabella, a 23-year-old influencer with a brand deal for every day of the week, he knew it was time to cut the dead weight. He had offered Audrey a settlement, $5 million, and the beach house in Oregon. It was generous, he thought. She had refused. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't thrown a vase. She had just looked at him with those sad hazel eyes and said, "I don't want your money, Preston. I want what's fair." Fair. Preston chuckled to himself as he adjusted his silk tie in the hallway mirror. Fair is what you can pay for. And Preston had paid for the best. Simon Rostov wasn't just a lawyer. He was a predator in a pinstripe suit. He was the managing partner at Rostov, Hale & Murray, the most feared family law firm on the West Coast. Rostov didn't lose. He obliterated. The drive to the King County Superior Court was smooth. As the black Escalade pulled up to the curb, flashes of light erupted. The paparazzi were there in force. Preston put on his somber billionaire face. He stepped out, waved briefly, and ignored the shouted questions about Isabella. Simon Rostov was waiting for him at the metal detectors. Simon was a short, round man, with eyes like beads of black glass. "She's here," Simon said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Room 304. Who is representing her?" Preston asked as they walked through the marble corridors. "Did she hire that hack from Legal Aid, or did she find some strip mall ambulance chaser?" Simon smirked, checking his Rolex. "That's the thing, Preston. We checked the docket this morning. No counsel is listed on record for the respondent. I sent a paralegal to peek inside. She's sitting at the defense table alone." Preston stopped walking. He actually laughed, a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the stone walls. "She's representing herself pro se." "It appears so," Simon said, smoothing his lapel. "This is going to be a slaughter. The judge is Holloway. He hates time wasters. If she doesn't have counsel and doesn't know civil procedure, he'll strike her pleadings before lunch. You'll have the divorce granted by noon, and we can motion for 0 alimony based on her failure to negotiate." "Perfect," Preston said. "God, she's even more pathetic than I thought." They entered courtroom 304. The air inside was stale and smelled of floor wax and old paper. The gallery was packed. Reporters were jammed into the back benches, pens poised. This was the high society divorce of the year. And there she was. Audrey sat at the right-hand table. She looked small. She was wearing a simple navy blue dress, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her hands were folded on the empty table in front of her. No stacks of files, no paralegals whispering in her ear. Just a single battered leather notebook. Preston strode down the aisle, the heels of his Italian shoes clicking loudly. He wanted everyone to look at him. He pulled out the heavy oak chair at the plaintiff's table and sat down, leaning back comfortably. Simon Rostoff began arranging huge stacks of evidence binders on their table, building a literal wall of paper between them and Audrey. It was a psychological tactic. "Look at how prepared we are. Look at how much we have against you." Audrey didn't even look up. "Audrey," Preston whispered across the aisle. The distance was only 5 feet. "You look tired." She turned her head slowly. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. "Hello, Preston." "Where is he?" Preston mocked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Did the check bounce, or did you finally realize no one wants to fight Callaway systems?" "I don't need a lawyer to tell the truth," Audrey said softly. Simon Rostoff snorted, covering his mouth to hide a grin. "Truth doesn't win in court, Mrs. Callaway. Procedure does. Precedent does. You're about to walk into a buzzsaw." "You should have taken the beach house," Preston added, his voice dropping to a cruel hiss. "Now you're going to leave here with nothing. I'll make sure the judge charges you for my legal fees for wasting the court's time. You'll be bankrupt by the time you walk out that door." "All rise!" the bailiff bellowed. The room scrambled to its feet as Judge Holloway entered. He was an older man with a reputation for being impatient and strictly by the book. He took his seat and adjusted his glasses, looking down at the docket. "Case number 49204, Callaway v. Callaway," the judge read. He looked at Preston's table. "Mr. Rostoff, I see you are present for the plaintiff." "Ready and prepared, Your Honor," Simon said, using his best courtroom baritone. The judge shifted his gaze to Audrey. He frowned. He looked at the empty chair beside her, then scanned the room as if expecting someone to be late. "Mrs. Callaway," the judge said, his voice stern. "Where is your counsel?" Audrey stood up. Her hands were trembling slightly. Preston noted with satisfaction. She was terrified. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaking. I was hoping to request a brief recess." "A recess?" Judge Halloway scoffed. "We haven't even started. Mrs. Calloway, this trial date was set 3 months ago. You have had ample time to secure representation. If you do not have a lawyer, we will proceed with you representing yourself. And let me warn you, I do not offer special leniency for pro se litigants." Preston leaned over to Simon. "Watch this," he whispered. "She's going to crumble." "I understand, Your Honor," Audrey said, taking a deep breath. "But my counsel, she is traveling from out of town. Her flight was delayed." "Out of town?" Simon Rostov stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a delay tactic. Mrs. Calloway knows she has no case. She is trying to stall the inevitable. We have witnesses flown in from New York and London. A delay costs my client thousands of dollars an hour." "Mr. Rostov is right." The judge nodded. "Mrs. Calloway, unless your attorney is walking through those doors in the next 30 seconds, I am ruling that you have waived your right to counsel for this opening session." Preston smirked at Audrey. "Checkmate." Audrey looked down at her watch. She looked back at the doors. Nothing happened. "Very well." The judge sighed. "Mr. Rostov, you may begin your opening statement." Boom! The sound wasn't a knock. It was the heavy double doors of the courtroom being shoved open with enough force that they bounced off the back walls. The noise echoed like a gunshot. Every head in the room turned. The court reporter stopped typing. Standing in the doorway was a woman. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, but she stood with the posture of a soldier. She wore a white suit that looked like it had been tailored in Milan, crisp and sharp, against the gloom of the hallway. She wore dark sunglasses, which she slowly removed, revealing piercing blue eyes that scanned the room with terrifying precision. But it was the silence that followed her entrance that was heavy. She didn't rush. She walked down the center aisle with a slow, rhythmic click of her heels. Behind her walked 4 younger associates. 2 men, 2 women, all carrying identical black briefcases, moving in formation like a Praetorian guard. Preston frowned. He didn't recognize her. He looked at Simon. Simon Rostov, however, had gone chalk white. The pen in his hand slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk. "Simon," Preston whispered. "Who is that?" Simon didn't answer. He looked like he had seen a ghost. The woman reached the gate that separated the gallery from the litigation area. The bailiff, who usually stopped anyone trying to pass, actually stepped back and held the gate open for her. She walked straight to the defense table. She didn't look at Preston. She didn't look at the judge. She looked at Audrey. She placed a hand on Audrey's shoulder, a gentle, protective gesture. Then she turned to the bench. "My apologies for the theatrics." "Your Honor," the woman said. Her voice was low, smoky, and commanded absolute authority. It wasn't loud yet. It carried to the back of the room effortlessly. Traffic on the I-5 is murder this time of morning. Judge Halloway was staring at her, his mouth slightly open. He squinted, leaning over his bench. "Counsel, I don't believe I have your name on my docket." The woman smiled. It was a cold smile, sharp. "No, you wouldn't, Judge Halloway. I haven't practiced in this state in 25 years. I had to file my pro-hack vice motion with the clerk downstairs 5 minutes ago." She signaled to one of her associates, who instantly produced a document and handed it to the bailiff to give to the judge. "I am Margaret Halloway," the woman announced. A murmur went through the crowd. The name didn't mean much to the reporters, but the judge flinched. "Margaret Halloway." The judge looked at the paperwork. "Any relation to the respondent? She's my daughter, Margaret said, dropping the bombshell that made Preston choke on his own breath. Preston's head snapped toward Audrey. Daughter Audrey was an orphan. She had told him her parents died in a car crash when she was 3. She was raised in foster care in Ohio. Who was this woman? And, Margaret continued, turning her gaze slowly toward Simon Rostov, I believe opposing counsel knows me by my professional name. Isn't that right? Simon? Simon Rostov was trembling. He stood up, his legs shaky. Your Honor, I request a recess. Denied. Margaret cut him off. You were just complaining about delays, Mr. Rostov. Let's not waste time. Margaret walked over to Preston's table. She leaned in, resting her knuckles on his evidence binders. She looked at Preston for the first time. It was like looking into the barrel of a gun. You're Preston Calloway, she said. It wasn't a question. I am, Preston said, trying to regain his composure. And who exactly are you supposed to be? Besides a late arrival. Margaret laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. She looked back at Simon. Tell him, Simon. Tell your client who I am. Tell him about the Vanguard oil case in '98. Tell him about the Senator Lasky impeachment. Simon swallowed hard. He looked at Preston, his eyes wide with panic. Preston, this is Margaret the Guillotine Halloway. She was the lead prosecutor for the Southern District of New York before she went private corporate defense. She hasn't lost a case since 1985. Preston felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. Margaret straightened up, smoothing her white jacket. I retired, Preston. I bought a vineyard in Tuscany. I was done with sharks like you. But then my daughter called me. She told me you mocked her. She told me you threatened to bankrupt her. Margaret walked back to her seat. Next to Audrey sat down and opened a single thin file folder. You wanted to fight Mr. Calloway, Margaret said, not even looking at him anymore. Congratulations. You just declared war on a nuclear power. The silence in courtroom 304 was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to have paused to listen. Preston Calloway stared at his wife, no at Audrey. For 10 years he had known her as the quiet, unassuming woman who clipped coupons and volunteered at the local animal shelter. He had pitied her lack of sophistication. He had looked down on her orphan backstory, thinking it made her lucky to have landed a man like him. Now sitting next to Margaret Halloway, a woman whose very name made his $800 an hour shark of a lawyer sweat. Audrey looked different. She wasn't slouching. Her chin was up. She looked like royalty. Rostov, Judge Halloway said, breaking the tension. Do you have any objections to Ms. Halloway's pro-hack vice motion? Simon Rostov wiped his forehead with a silk handkerchief. No, Your Honor, though the sudden appearance is highly irregular. Irregular is my specialty, Simon, Margaret said without looking up from her file. Now are we going to posture or are we going to proceed? Opening statements, the judge squeaked. Simon stood up. Usually this was his moment. He would pace the floor, charm the press, and paint the opposing party as a gold digger. But today his legs felt like lead. He walked to the jury box, even though there was no jury. It was a habit, and turned to the judge. Your Honor, Simon began, his voice lacking its usual boom. This is a simple case of a contract. 10 years ago, Preston Calloway and Audrey Calloway signed a prenuptial agreement. That agreement states clearly that in the event of a divorce, Mrs. Calloway is entitled to a lump sum of $100,000 for every year of marriage. We have offered her $5 million, far above the contractual obligation. She refused. We are simply asking the court to enforce the document she signed. Simon sat down quickly. He wanted to minimize exposure. Margaret Halloway didn't stand up immediately. She took a sip of water. She adjusted her glasses. Then she slowly rose. She didn't walk to the jury box. She walked right up to Preston. She stood 3 feet from him, ignoring his lawyer entirely. 10 years ago. Margaret began, her voice filling the room. My client was a 22-year-old waitress. She was in love. She believed that the man sitting here, she pointed a manicured finger at Preston, was a brilliant but struggling inventor. She didn't care about money. In fact, when she signed that prenuptial agreement, she didn't even read it. She trusted him. Margaret turned to the judge. Mr. Rostov calls this a contract case. I call it a fraud case. Objection, Simon shouted, finding his spine. Fraud. That is a serious accusation, and I have serious proof. Margaret shot back, her voice snapping like a whip. Your Honor, the prenuptial agreement is void. Preston laughed. He couldn't help it. Void. It was drafted by Sterling and Cooper. It's ironclad. Margaret turned her cold blue gaze on him. Mr. Calloway, you are not addressing the court. Be quiet. She pulled a document from her folder. In the state of Washington, a prenuptial agreement is only valid if there is a full and fair disclosure of assets at the time of signing. If one party hides money, the contract is trash. I disclosed everything, Preston hissed. I had nothing back then, just the patents. Is that so? Margaret smiled. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a trapped rabbit. Audrey, dear, pass me Exhibit A. Audrey handed her mother a piece of paper. This, Margaret said, holding it up, is a bank statement from the Bank of Nevis, located in the Caribbean. It is dated 3 weeks before the wedding. It shows a balance of $4 million in an account under the name PC Holdings. The color drained from Preston's face. How? Preston stammered. How did you get that? Banking secrecy isn't what it used to be, Preston, Margaret said smoothly. Especially when you have the resources I do. You sold your first algorithm to a Japanese firm 2 months before you married my daughter. You parked the money offshore so she wouldn't get a cent if it didn't work out. You lied on the financial disclosure form attached to the prenup. That is fraud. That voids the agreement. She dropped the paper onto the defense table. So, Margaret continued, since there is no valid prenup, Washington community property laws apply. That means my daughter isn't entitled to a handout. She is entitled to half. Half of the company, half of the real estate, half of the patents, and half of that $40 billion government contract you just signed. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were frantically typing on their phones. Half of $40 billion. It was the biggest divorce claim in state history. Simon Rostov looked like he was having a cardiac event. He leaned over to Preston. Is it true? Did you have that account? I thought it was untraceable, Preston whispered furiously. It was 10 years ago. Who digs that deep? She does, Simon groaned. Preston, you didn't tell me you lied on the disclosure. If the prenup falls, you're exposed. We need to settle. No. Preston slammed his hand on the table. I'm not giving her half my company. She's a nobody. She's a waitress. Margaret heard him. She turned slowly. A nobody? Margaret asked softly. You think because she served coffee, she's beneath you. You think because she didn't use my name. She didn't have my blood. Margaret walked back to Audrey and placed a hand on her shoulder. My daughter ran away from home when she was 18, Mr. Calloway. Not because she was poor, but because she was rich. Too rich. She grew up in a world of sharks and snakes watching me tear men like you apart. She hated it. She wanted a simple life. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for the Halloway fortune. Audrey looked up at Preston, tears in her eyes. I just wanted to be your wife, Preston. I would have signed anything. If you had just told me the truth about the money, I wouldn't have cared. But you started our marriage with a lie, and you ended it with cruelty. Touching, Preston sneered, masking his fear with aggression. But a bank statement from 10 years ago proves nothing. I'll say it was a clerical error. I'll say you knew about it. Oh, we're just getting started, Preston, Margaret said, closing her file. That was just the appetizer. Wait until we get to the main course. Judge Halloway banged his gavel. Order, order in the court. Given the new evidence regarding the validity of the prenuptial agreement, I am inclined to schedule a hearing on that specific issue. We will recess for lunch and reconvene at 1:30 p.m. All rise. As the room shuffled out, Preston stood up. He glared at Audrey. You think bringing your mummy here scares me, he hissed. I have resources you can't imagine. I'll bury you in litigation for 20 years. You'll be old and grey before you see a dime. Margaret stepped in between them. She was shorter than Preston, but she loomed larger. Preston, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. You have a tea time at Cypress Point at 3, don't you? Preston blinked. How did you? I know everything, Margaret said. I know about the tea time. I know about Isabella. And I know about the Sapphire Protocol. Preston froze. His heart actually skipped a beat. See you after lunch? Margaret said, winking. She took her daughter's arm and led her out of the courtroom, leaving the billionaire standing there, looking like he had just seen his own executioner. The lunch break was a disaster for Preston. He and Simon Rostoff were holed up in a private conference room at a nearby luxury hotel. The table was covered in half-eaten sandwiches and scatterings of legal pads. What is the Sapphire Protocol? Simon asked, pacing the room. Preston, you have to be honest with me. If she knows about it and it scared you that much, I need to know. Preston was staring out the window, swirling a glass of scotch. It's nothing. Just some internal R&D code. Don't lie to me, Simon snapped. That woman is Margaret Halloway. She was the one who took down Enron executives before it was cool. She dismantled the Valkyrie cartel. If she drops a name, it's a bomb. What is Sapphire? Preston turned his face tight. It's an algorithm. A predictive AI for drone targeting. It's the centerpiece of the government contract. Okay, Simon said slowly. Is it legal? Of course it's legal, Preston said, though his eyes shifted away. But the ownership is complicated. I developed the core code while I was still technically employed by my previous employer, Techdyne. Simon threw his hands in the air. Intellectual property theft. You built a $40 billion empire on stolen code. It wasn't stolen, I improved it, Preston yelled. But if Techdyne finds out, they could sue for ownership of the entire platform. It would bankrupt Calloway Systems overnight. And Margaret knows, Simon whispered, sinking into a chair. She's going to use the divorce discovery process to subpoena the source code. Once she makes it public record, Techdyne will see it. She's holding a grenade with the pin pulled. So stop her, Preston demanded. File a motion to seal the records. Claim national security. I can try, Simon said, wiping sweat from his upper lip. But Halloway is smart. She won't ask for the code directly. She'll ask for the development timeline to prove the value of the marital assets. It's a back door." Preston growled and threw his glass into the fireplace, shattering it. "She wants a war fine. If she destroys the company, she gets half of nothing. Does she realize that she's burning down the house to kill the spider?" "I don't think she cares about the money, Preston," Simon said quietly. "She wants blood." Back in the courtroom at 1:30 p.m., the atmosphere had shifted. The press gallery was now overflowing. Word had gotten out. The guillotine was back in court. Margaret Halloway looked refreshed. She had changed her scarf to a vibrant crimson silk. Audrey looked calmer, her hand resting on her mother's arm. "Mr. Rostov," Judge Halloway said, "we are back on the record. You are going to address the motion regarding the prenuptial agreement." "Your Honor." Simon said, his voice shaky. "My client wishes to explore settlement options." Preston shot Simon a glare, but stayed silent. It was the smart play. Delay. Negotiate. "Settlement." Margaret laughed from her seat. She didn't stand up this time. "Your Honor, we are past settlement. Mr. Calloway had his chance this morning. He offered my daughter insults and humiliation. The price has gone up." "What do you want?" Simon asked across the aisle. Margaret stood up. "I want to discuss the valuation of the marital estate, specifically the value of Calloway Systems." "The company is valued at $50 billion, Simon said. "That is public knowledge." "Is it?" Margaret walked to the center of the room. "Because if the company's flagship product, the Sapphire AI, is proven to be based on stolen intellectual property, the value is zero. Actually, less than zero. It's a liability." Preston jumped up. "Objection! This is slander. There is no proof of that." "Sit down, Mr. Calloway," the judge warned. Margaret turned to the back of the room. "Your Honor, the defense calls its first witness, Dr. Phoenix Pendleton." Preston froze. Phoenix Pendleton. The name was a ghost from his past. Phoenix was his old roommate, the guy who used to code with him in the garage. The guy Preston had cut out of the company 10 years ago with a check for $10,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. An older man in a tweed jacket walked in. He looked nervous, clutching a briefcase. "Dr. Pendleton," Margaret said, as the man took the stand and was sworn in. "You know Mr. Calloway?" "I do," Phoenix said, refusing to look at Preston. "We were partners before he incorporated." "And during the time of your partnership, did you work on a project called Sapphire?" "Objection," Simon shouted. "Relevance, this is a divorce trial, not a patent dispute." "It goes to the assets, Your Honor," Margaret said calmly. "If Mr. Calloway committed fraud to build his fortune, that fortune is fruit of the poisonous tree and subject to different division rules. Plus it speaks to his character." "Overruled," the judge said, leaning forward. "Answer the question." "Yes," Phoenix said quietly. "We wrote the base code for Sapphire together, using servers at Tech Dine, where we both worked." "And when Mr. Calloway left to start his own company," Margaret asked, "did he have permission to take that code?" Phoenix shook his head. "No, he copied it onto a hard drive. He told me he deleted it. But 6 months later, Calloway Systems launched a product that was identical." The courtroom buzzed. Preston felt the walls closing in. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was a criminal indictment being broadcast live. "Thank you, Dr. Pendleton," Margaret said. She turned to Preston. "Now, Mr. Calloway, here is the situation. I have a sworn affidavit from Dr. Pendleton. I have the original server logs from Tech9. Don't ask how I got those. I can enter this into the public record right now. She held up a USB drive. If I give this to the clerk, Margaret said, her voice hard as steel, your stock crashes by tomorrow morning. The DOJ opens an investigation. You go to prison for IP theft and fraud. Audrey gets nothing true. But you lose everything. Your freedom, your reputation, your legacy. The room was deadly silent. Or, Margaret continued, we can come to an arrangement. Preston was sweating profusely. He tugged at his collar. He looked at Simon. Simon just shook his head, signaling, you have no choice. What do you want? Preston rasped his voice, sounding like broken glass. Margaret smiled. She didn't look at Preston. She looked at Audrey. Audrey, darling, Margaret said, what do you want? Audrey stood up. She looked at the man who had bullied her, cheated on her, and mocked her for 10 years. She looked at the man who had terrified her just hours ago. Now he looked small. I want the truth, Audrey said firmly. I want you to admit on the record that you lied, that you cheated, and that I helped you build this company. And, Preston asked, waiting for the dollar amount. And, Audrey continued, I want the house, not the beach house, the penthouse, and I want 51% of the voting shares of Callaway Systems. What? Preston screamed. 51%. That's my company. That's control. You want to take my company? You built it on stolen land, Preston. Margaret interjected. Audrey is just correcting management. If you give her 51%, she controls the board. She can fire you. She can hire you. She owns you. I will never, Preston started. Clerk, Margaret said, turning to the court officer. Please mark this USB drive as Exhibit B. Wait, Preston shouted. He scrambled out of his chair. Wait. Don't enter it. He looked at the USB drive. He looked at the press. He looked at Audrey. He realized for the first time in his life he had lost, totally and completely. 51%, Preston whispered, defeated. And the penthouse. And a formal apology, Audrey added. Right now. Preston closed his eyes. He swallowed his pride, which tasted like bile. I apologize, Audrey. I treated you poorly. I underestimated you. No, Audrey said, her voice ringing clear. You didn't underestimate me. You underestimated my mother. Margaret Holloway closed her file with a sharp snap. Smartest thing you've said all day, Preston, Margaret said. Now sit down. We have paperwork to sign. The transfer of power at Callaway Systems was supposed to take weeks. Margaret Holloway made sure it happened in 48 hours. On Monday morning, the atmosphere inside the 40-story glass tower in downtown Seattle was toxic. Rumors had spread like wildfire over the weekend. The staff knew Preston had lost. They knew about the stolen code allegations, though those had been sealed by the court to protect the company's value. But mostly, they knew that a waitress was coming to take the big chair. Preston had arrived early. He was no longer the CEO, but as part of the settlement, he remained as Chief Technical Officer. It was a humiliation, but he had no choice. If he left, the non-compete clauses Margaret had drafted would bar him from touching a computer for 10 years. He sat in his new office 2 floors down from the penthouse suite, smaller with a view of an alleyway instead of the harbor. Simon Rostov sat across from him. "This is temporary," Preston muttered, spinning a pen in his fingers. "She has 51% of the stock, but she doesn't have the loyalty of the board, and she definitely doesn't have the respect of the engineers. They hate her. They think she's a gold digger who stole their boss's company." "We need to be careful, Preston," Simon warned. "Margaret is watching everything." "Margaret is an old woman," Preston scoffed. "She can't code. She doesn't understand the tech. Watch, I've already set the trap." "What trap?" Preston smiled, a cruel, thin expression. "The Obsidian update. It's scheduled to push to our government clients at noon today. I tweaked the deployment protocols last night. It's going to crash. Hard. It will look like incompetence from the new leadership. The stock will tank. The board will call for a vote of no confidence. They'll beg me to take the CEO spot back just to stop the bleeding." "That's risky," Simon whispered. "If they trace it to you, they won't. I used Audrey's login credentials. I fished her password yesterday. As far as the logs show, the new chairwoman tried to optimize the system and broke it." At 9:00 a.m. sharp, the elevator to the executive floor opened. Audrey stepped out. She wasn't wearing the navy dress from the courtroom. She was wearing a cream-colored power suit, tailored perfectly. Her hair was down, cascading in soft waves. She didn't look like a waitress. She looked like the owner. Margaret was right behind her, acting as her shadow. They walked past the bullpen of executive assistants. The typing stopped. Heads turned. Snickers were audible. "Coffee black, 2 sugars, Art," a junior VP shouted from his cubicle as Audrey passed, clearly mocking her past job. A ripple of laughter went through the room. Audrey stopped. She turned slowly on her heel. The room went silent. She walked over to the VP's desk. He was a young man named Greg, one of Preston's fraternity brothers. He smirked at her, leaning back in his chair. "Excuse me," Audrey asked softly. "I said coffee." Greg grinned. "Since you're heading to the break room, anyway, right? Old habits?" Audrey looked at him. She didn't get angry. She didn't yell. She reached down, picked up the nameplate on his desk, and looked at it. "Greg Miller, Vice President of Domestic Sales," she read. She dropped the nameplate into the trash can next to his desk with a loud thud. "Pack your things, Greg," Audrey said calmly. You can't fire me." Greg stammered, his smirk vanishing. "Preston hired me." "Preston works for me now," Audrey said, her voice projecting across the silent office. "And so do you. Disrespecting the chairwoman is gross misconduct. You have 5 minutes to clear your desk before security escorts you out. And, Greg, don't steal any staplers. We'll be checking your bag." She turned and walked away. The office was dead silent. The snickering was gone. Fear had replaced it. Audrey walked into the main conference room, where the senior staff was waiting. Preston was there, sitting at the head of the table out of habit. "You're in my seat, Preston," Audrey said. Preston glared at her, his jaw tightening. He slowly stood up and moved to a side chair. "Just keeping it warm for you, chairwoman." "Let's get started," Audrey said, taking the seat. "I've reviewed the financials over the weekend. The spending in the marketing department is absurd. We are cutting the corporate retreat to Aspen." "You can't do that," Preston objected. "That's how we court clients." "No, that's how you party with your mistresses on company dimes," Audrey corrected. "It's cancelled." Preston seethed. He checked his watch. 11:55 a.m. 5 minutes until the Obsidian update pushed. 5 minutes until the system crashed and Audrey was ruined. "Fine," Preston said, "but we have a major software deployment at noon. The obsidian patch, it's critical. I assume you've approved the final code. I saw the schedule, Audrey said, looking at her tablet. Great. Preston smirked. So we are go for launch. Actually, Audrey said, looking up. I cancelled it. Preston froze. You... what? I cancelled the deployment, Audrey said casually. I had an external auditor review the code last night. They found some irregularities. It seems someone logged in using my credentials at 200 a.m. and altered the boot sequence to cause a catastrophic failure. The color drained from Preston's face. That's impossible, Preston stammered. Is it? Audrey tapped the screen. We traced the IP address. It came from the Wi-Fi network at the Fairmont Hotel. Room 402. Isn't that where you're staying since I kicked you out of the penthouse, Preston? The board members turned to look at Preston. Their eyes were wide. Attempted corporate sabotage is a felony. Preston. Margaret spoke up from the corner of the room where she had been silently observing. We could call the FBI. Again. Preston stood up, his hands shaking. It was a stress test. I was testing her vigilance. Sit down, Audrey commanded. The authority in her voice cracked like a whip. Preston sat. I'm not calling the FBI, Audrey said, because the stock price would suffer. But strike one, Preston. You have 2 left. And since you like stress tests, I have a task for you. The archives in the basement haven't been digitized. Since you are the chief technical officer, I want you to personally oversee the scanning of 100,000 documents, by hand. You start now. I am not a clerk, Preston shouted. No. Audrey smiled. You're an employee, and if you refuse a direct assignment, I can fire you for cause, and you lose your severance package. The basement is that way. She pointed to the door. Preston stood up, humiliated, red-faced and shaking with rage. He stormed out of the conference room. Audrey let out a breath she had been holding. She looked at her mother. Margaret gave her a subtle, proud nod. But Audrey knew this wasn't over. Preston was a wounded animal, and wounded animals were the most dangerous kind. 2 weeks later, Callaway Systems unveiled its annual Future of Tech Gala, Seattle's most coveted invitation, beneath the soaring steel ribs of the Museum of Flight. Champagne flowed beneath suspended aircraft. Billionaires murmured beside senators. Tech titans smiled while calculating one another's worth. For the first time in a decade, Audrey Callaway wasn't absent. She was the host. Preston had always found reasons to leave her behind. You wouldn't understand the conversation. You don't have the right dress. Tonight, every excuse lay buried beneath emerald velvet and diamonds that caught the light like quiet defiance. She looked stunning. She felt like prey. He's planning something, Audrey murmured to her mother as they greeted guests. 2 weeks locked in the basement. Too quiet. Margaret didn't flinch. Let him plot. We're ready. Lift your chin. You own this room. Preston arrived late, and he made sure no one missed him. The chatter died as he entered, arm-hooked possessively around Isabella Young, radiant, dressed in shimmering silver that seemed designed to provoke. The woman he'd left Audrey for. The insult was deliberate. Preston laughed too loudly, shook too many hands, introduced Isabella as the future Mrs. Callaway, like a declaration of war. Cameras flashed. Whispers rippled. Audrey's spine stiffened. He's coming here, she said. Ignore him, Margaret advised. I can't. Preston stopped directly in front of them. His breath carried alcohol. Audrey, he boomed. You look expensive. Already spending company money. Hello, Preston, Audrey replied coolly. Welcome. Isabella's lips curled. Cute dress, very vintage. Thrift store, a collective inhale. Audrey smiled. Vintage Dior. Commissioned for Princess Grace. But I don't expect you to recognize it. Shane doesn't carry archival couture. Laughter rippled. Isabella flushed. Preston's smile collapsed. He grabbed a nearby microphone. Ladies and gentlemen. Feedback screeched. The room froze. Tonight I reveal the real future of Callaway Systems. Margaret moved forward. Audrey stopped her. Let him. While my ex-wife rearranged furniture, Preston continued. I secured the biggest deal in our history. The screen ignited with a logo. Apex Dynamics. Gasps echoed. I've tendered my remaining shares and the board's voting proxies to Apex. They've made an offer for the rest. Double market value. His gaze locked on Audrey. Sell or be reduced to a powerless minority. Apex will gut the company. Fire everyone. Choose. Isabella clapped. Take the money and disappear. Audrey scanned the room. Board members avoided her eyes. Employees stood rigid at the back. Engineers' assistants, builders of a dream, now threatened with erasure. She walked to the stage. Preston smirked as she took the microphone. Preston believes a company is just code and stock, Audrey said evenly. That people are interchangeable. She faced him. You tendered your shares binding, he crowed, and Apex is foreign-owned, Audrey continued, based in a nation under U.S. tech export sanctions. His confidence wavered. Yesterday, Audrey said, pulling a document from her clutch, I met with the Department of Defense. Any sale involving classified defense contracts triggers an automatic national security review. She held up the paper. This is a cease and desist. The sale is blocked. Permanently. Silence fell like a dropped blade. And because you attempted to transfer restricted assets without clearance, Audrey finished, that constitutes treason. Preston's hands shook. The FBI is in the lobby, Audrey said calmly. They're here for you. The doors opened. Agents entered. Isabella screamed and fled. Preston looked at Audrey, rage and terror colliding. You set me up, he hissed. No, Audrey said softly. You did that yourself. As Preston Callaway was led away in handcuffs, cameras flashing, Audrey didn't smile. Margaret lifted her glass. To the future. Audrey exhaled. The battle was over. The purge was next. The morning after the gala, the headquarters of Callaway Systems felt less like a technology firm and more like a sealed-off crime scene. Federal agents still moved through the corridors with brisk efficiency cardboard boxes stacked in their arms as they emptied Preston's corner office. Entire server racks marked Obsidian were being mirrored and audited under Department of Defense supervision. But the real reckoning was unfolding 40 floors above, inside the executive boardroom. 10 directors sat around the long mahogany table, the same 10 who had voted to strip Audrey of her company less than a day earlier. Jackets were wrinkled eyes, bloodshot. Confidence drained from every face. They looked like people who hadn't slept and knew they wouldn't for a long time. When the double doors opened, they braced themselves for Preston. Instead, Audrey walked in. She came alone. Margaret waited outside at her request. This part is mine. Audrey took the chair at the head of the table and set a single folder down with deliberate calm. For a full minute, she said nothing. She simply studied them one by one until the silence became unbearable. "Mrs. Calloway," Thomas Sterling finally said, clearing his throat. The chairman's voice trembled. "We need to explain. Last night's vote, we were misled. Preston assured us the Pentagon deal was cleared. We were victims of his deception. Just like you." Audrey met his gaze without blinking. "Victims?" she asked quietly. "You sit on the Defense Advisory Council, Thomas. You knew the regulations. You didn't check because you didn't want to. Apex promised a payout, and you chose greed." Linda, seated halfway down the table, snapped to attention. "We acted in the fiduciary interest of shareholders. That offer doubled valuation. If you pursue this, we'll counter-sue for negligence." Audrey opened the folder. "I'm not suing you," she said. "That takes too long." She slid a document across the table. "These are the corporate bylaws. Article 9, Section C, conduct detrimental to the company. Attempting to sell classified assets to a sanctioned entity qualifies. It allows the majority shareholder to remove any director immediately. No vote required." The room went still. "You're removing the entire board," Thomas whispered. "The market will punish this." "Who runs the company?" "The people who actually built it," Audrey replied. "Engineering, customer support, HR, people who understand the product instead of just the stock." "This is suicide," Linda shouted, rising from her seat. "We'll destroy you in the press. We'll paint you as a vindictive ex-wife who snapped." Audrey leaned back, unflinching. "Before you call reporters," she said, "call your attorneys. The FBI isn't only investigating Preston. They're investigating everyone who signed that letter of intent." Linda slowly sat down. "If you resign quietly," Audrey continued, "I won't turn over the board minutes discussing Apex's bribes. It was a lie, but it was a believable one." Thomas reached for his pen. His hand shook as he signed. One by one, the others followed. As they filed out, silent, diminished, Audrey felt no triumph, only relief. The rot was gone. Her phone buzzed, a collect call. SeaTac Federal Detention Center. "Preston," Audrey answered. By the time she hung up and blocked the number, the fog outside the windows had lifted. Some endings didn't need applause. They just needed to be final. 6 months later. The rebranding of the company had been seamless. Halloway Systems was now the darling of the tech world. The stock hadn't crashed, it had soared. The market, it turned out, liked stability and ethical leadership more than it liked rock star CEOs who committed treason. Audrey was sitting in her office, the real office, the penthouse suite. She had redecorated. The cold chrome and black leather were gone, replaced with warm wood plants and natural light. On her desk sat a single envelope. It was from the federal court. Today was Preston's sentencing. She hadn't gone. She didn't need to see him in an orange jumpsuit to know he was defeated. Margaret had gone in her place to ensure the interests of the company were protected during the asset forfeiture hearing. The door opened, and Kevin, the assistant who used to be terrified of Preston, walked in. He was smiling. He liked working for Audrey. She remembered his birthday. She paid him overtime. "Ms. Halloway," Kevin said, "your mother is here?" Margaret walked in. She looked different, too. She had traded her sharp litigation suits for a softer linen jacket. She looked like a grandmother, not a shark. But the shark was still in there, swimming just beneath the surface. "Well?" Audrey asked, not looking up from her paperwork. 15 years, Margaret said, sitting down and pouring herself a tea. "Minimum security if he behaves, but the asset seizure was total. The government took the offshore accounts. Techdyne sued for the IP theft and won a settlement that took the rest of his liquid cash. He is for all intents and purposes destitute. Audrey nodded. She felt a pang of pity, but it was fleeting. Preston had made his choices. "And Isabella?" Audrey asked. Margaret chuckled. "She filed for an annulment of their engagement the day he was arrested. Last I heard, she's dating a cryptocurrency promoter in Miami. She's selling a tell-all book about her life with Preston. It's titled Billionaire's Betrayal." "Of course she is," Audrey sighed. "There is one more thing," Margaret said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet box. "Preston asked his lawyer to give this to you. The judge allowed it." Audrey took the box. She opened it. Inside was a cheap plastic ring. A mood ring. Audrey gasped. It was the ring Preston had given her when he proposed back in the garage in Tacoma. He couldn't afford a diamond then. He had promised to replace it one day. He never did until the 10-carat rock he bought to show off to his investors. But this was the ring from when they were happy. He said, Margaret relayed that it was the only thing he owned that was real, and he wanted you to have it. Audrey looked at the cheap plastic band. It was blue. Calm. She stood up and walked to the balcony. The city was bustling below her. She held the ring over the railing. For a moment, she thought about keeping it. A reminder of the boy she had loved before the money destroyed him. But then she remembered the courtroom, the mockery, the cruelty, the way he had looked at her like she was trash. "No," Audrey whispered. She didn't drop the ring. That would be dramatic. Instead, she put the lid back on the box and handed it to Kevin. "Kevin," Audrey said, "put this in the donation bin for the Goodwill truck." "The Goodwill truck, Ma'am?" Kevin asked, confused. "Yes." Audrey smiled. "Someone might find it charming. It's not my style anymore." Margaret smiled, raising her teacup. "A fitting end." "Not an end," Audrey corrected her mother. She picked up a file from her desk. It was the blueprint for the new Holloway Foundation headquarters, a center that would provide legal aid to women going through high-conflict divorces. "This," Audrey said, tapping the file, "is a beginning." The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Holloway, the delegation from the United Nations is here to discuss the humanitarian drone project." Audrey buttoned her jacket. She looked at her reflection in the glass. She didn't see a victim. She didn't see a billionaire's wife. She saw Audrey Holloway. "Send them in," she said. "This story isn't just about a divorce. It's a lesson in humility." Preston Calloway thought his power lay in his bank account, his lawyers, and his title. He forgot that true power comes from integrity, loyalty, and the people you surround yourself with. He underestimated Audrey because she was kind, mistaking her silence for weakness. But as he learned the hard way, the quietest people often have the loudest impact when they finally decide to speak. In the end, Audrey didn't just take his money. She took back her dignity, proving that while you can buy a lawyer, you can't buy the truth. Wow, what a journey. From a mocked wife to the CEO of a billion-dollar empire, Audrey really showed Preston what karma looks like. If you enjoyed this story and loved seeing justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And tell me in the comments, do you think Preston deserved 15 years or was losing his company enough punishment? I read every comment. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching. and I'll see you in the next one.